Welcome to Roy Morgan's final webinar of 2025, a deep dive into the telecommunications industry. Before we get going, I have breaking news. In the single month of October 2025, Optus was Australia's most distrusted brand. According to the Roy Morgan Risk Monitor, Optus's reputation deteriorated sharply following the Triple Zero outage in September. This number one monthly ranking is a clear warning signal for the next quarter's results. More on Optus shortly. First, let's be clear about definitions. Trust is a social contract with the brand and the expectation that it will do the right thing. Distrust is a sense of personal anger and disappointment that that contract has been broken. Brands don't lose customers because people stop trusting. They lose them because people start distrusting. And distrust doesn't just creep in, it detonates. It triggers switching, backlash, and reputational contagion. So for telcos operating in one of the nation's most distrusted sectors, the real risk isn't low or even no trust. It's distrusters turning into angry activists. This trajectory shows how distrust accumulates. Doubt is the entry point, but it's rarely the exit. As people move through suspicion, anxiety, and fear, something fundamental happens. Their mindset shifts from evaluation to self-protection. And once consumers enter self-protection, they're no longer open to reassurance. They're looking for the exits. Switching, criticising, warning others. At that stage, they're not just protecting themselves, they're defending themselves. For telcos, the insight is simple. You don't just need a scandal or an outage to lose customers. Enough velocity along this trajectory will do the same job. Distrust is dangerous. These examples show one thing clearly. In telecoms, distrust isn't abstract, it's financially material. SK Telecom lost almost 90% of its quarterly operating profit after its data breach in April. Here at home, Optus has endured years of rolling crises, culminating in the emergency call failures, a catastrophic violation of public trust, with customers switching and regulators circling. And T-Mobile in the US has spent more than $500 million cleaning up after repeated breaches. So the lesson is really simple. Once distrust ignites in this sector, it destroys value, fast, publicly, and at scale. This chart shows how the pandemic shifted Australia from a trust-leaning nation to a distrust-leaning one. COVID didn't just spike distrust, it normalised it. Even with recent improvement, far more Australians nominate a distrusted brand than a trusted one. The baseline has changed. And for telcos, that raises the stakes. In a population already primed to distrust, every incident amplifies. It amplifies faster, it hits harder, and takes longer to recover from. This chart shows that government services, the backbone of essential services, are more distrusted than trusted and have been for almost a decade. This isn't about politics or parties, it's a broader loss of confidence in the institutions people rely on every day. What matters is the pattern. Even as circumstances change, distrust remains elevated. And that signals a national mindset where institutions are not to be trusted. And in that environment, private essential service providers like telcos face an even more brutal reality. People are quicker to assume failure and are slower to forgive. Now let's move on to how this national shift in sentiment is affecting various industry sectors. This chart shows how uneven the trust landscape has become across the Australian economy. Only a handful of industries sit in positive territory, while most fall into net distrust. Remember, in the single month of October, telecommunications was the nation's most distrusted industry. Here it appears as number 2, a position likely to worsen in our next quarterly update. Overall, it's a structurally imbalanced environment, one where industries must work harder simply to stay out of that distrust zone. In the next section, we'll explore the latest rankings of Australia's most trusted and distrusted brands. The top trusted brands in Australia are remarkably stable. For the 12 months to September 2025, the top 4 haven't shifted at all. And the only movement inside the top 5 is the Commonwealth Bank improving, pushing Toyota down a ranking. This stability tells us something important. Trusted brands can hold their ground, even in a high distrust environment. It's also worth noting what isn't here. No telecommunication brands appear in the trusted top 20, a reminder of how unevenly trust is distributed across the economy. The most distrusted brands in Australia are also highly stable, with the top 4 unchanged this quarter. Optus remains in 4th place, reflecting ongoing fallout from the 2022 data breach and its persistent outages. 2 telco brands appear in this top 20, a reminder that distrust clusters in sectors where failure is highly visible and personally consequential. The single-month October data for Optus suggests further deterioration is just around the corner. Telstra's improved slightly, driven by fewer mentions of unaffordable pricing and poor service. Overall, the pattern is clear. Distrust is sticky, and once a brand enters this list, it becomes very difficult to climb out. Now we turn to telecommunications, an industry under intense scrutiny and one of the most distrusted in the country. At Roy Morgan, we track 27 telecommunication brands in the risk monitor. Of these, 9 have sample sizes large enough to feature in the main risk report. The remaining brands are monitored continuously, and we can produce deeper, customised insights when required. The telco industry has long sat in net distrust territory, but the past few years have seen that pattern intensify. The Optus data breach in 2022, the Telstra and TPG breaches, and the nationwide outage in 2023 all served to deepen distrust across the entire sector. We saw some recovery through 2024, with distrust easing just slightly. But the Optus September 2025 fatal 000 outage is likely to reverse those gains. In telecommunications, every major incident resets the clock, and the fallout rarely stays confined to a single brand. The challenge now isn't just mitigating distrust, it's breaking a cycle where one crisis continually undermines the whole industry. Concerns about privacy and security among Australians with mobile phones rose sharply after the Optus data breach, and since then, worry about privacy risks from new technology has become the dominant concern, overtaking general security consciousness. Reliability, that's the yellow line, has increased notably as a reason for trusting telcos over the past 6 months, reflecting steady delivery of stable, quality services. At the same time, customer-focused is becoming less common as a reason for trust, even as perceptions of product and service quality continue to rise. That's the green line. Customer service and privacy concerns, the orange and blue lines, have been drifting down as reasons for distrust, but unreliability, the red line, is now rising fast. The clearest signal that Australians are losing patience with telcos that can't deliver the basics. Privacy, which spiked dramatically after the data breaches, has eased back over the past year. Now, that doesn't mean Australians no longer care. It means breaches have become normalised, expected rather than exceptional. When reliability falters, however, distrust escalates quickly. Over the past year, the telco brand ladder has barely moved, but the story beneath it definitely has. Aussie Broadband and amaysim continue to dominate trust, with Vodafone the only brand making a meaningful gain. TPG slips, driven by a softening in trust. On the Distrust side, Optus and Telstra remain firmly entrenched at the top, while Dodo and Huawei swap places. iNet's move into neutral territory signals a weakening of its traditional trust advantage. The standout insight is amaysim. Despite being owned by Optus, it remains untouched by the fallout from Optus's scandals. Consumers clearly don't associate the two brands. Now, Optus's distrust, that's the teal line, surged after September 2022 data breach, and it's remained the most distrusted telco ever since, even as Telstra's distrust, the blue line, fluctuated, notably dipping during 2023 before climbing back again. Optus has not significantly reclaimed lost ground. The gaps you see here reflect two different dynamics. Optus is still carrying long-tail reputational damage from repeated failures, while Telstra's movements are driven more by short-term pricing and service issues. The industry's relative positions are stable, but the underlying trajectories suggest that once formed, distrust is far harder to unwind for deeply distrusted brands than for others. Now, looking more closely at Optus. Optus is now operating inside what neuroscience calls a reactivation loop. Once a brand becomes associated with distrust, the memory network reorganises around that idea. So when a new Optus event occurs, a penalty, an outage, a headline, it doesn't land in isolation. One node lights up and the whole network fires. Breach, unreliable, unsafe, chaotic, poor service. That's why the fatal 000 outage instantly reignited deep-seated distrust. Consumers aren't judging each incident separately anymore. They're experiencing a single, coherent, emotional response. And until that neural network is rewired, any new misstep will trigger the same cascade. What's striking here is how the shape of distrust has shifted for Optus. Privacy, the blue line, was the dominant driver in the immediate aftermath of the 2022 breach. But over the past year, that intensity has eased. Not because the issue's fixed, but because people have adjusted. The shock's worn off. What hasn't eased is frustration with reliability. That yellow line has surged again in recent months, showing that Australians are no longer responding to Optus through a single issue lens. They're reacting to day-to-day performance, outages, failures, and service instability. And this is where Optus is most vulnerable. Reliability taps straight into that reactivation loop. Every new disruption triggers the entire memory, making distrust both broader and harder to reverse. Optus's distrust is even more pronounced among the all-important business community, with distrust currently 23% higher among business decision makers than the general population. Now, Roy Morgan's benchmark recovery rate measures how quickly a brand can rebuild trust after a reputational crisis. Using the average recovery rate across 17 brands over the past 7 years, we track a brand's monthly net trust and distrust scores against the benchmark rate. We found that the recovery process is non-linear and fragile, and that in many cases the effort required to rebuild trust is greater than the effort needed to lose it, and that recovery takes much longer than expected. For example, after 12 months, 92% of brands hadn't fully recovered. After 2 years, 75% hadn't recovered. 50% still hadn't recovered after 4 years. And even after 5 years, 20% hadn't fully recovered. Averaging how long it took the 17 brands to recover, this is what the benchmark recovery rate looks like over 66 months. What's interesting is that if you haven't achieved good recovery, around 60%, in the first 9 months, The next 4 years are a real slog. Optus had been slowly clawing its way back towards the benchmark recovery rate after the 2023 outage. A long, uneven journey, but one that finally converged with the benchmark in late 2025. That progress is now at serious risk. The Triple Zero outage is not just another service failure, it's a breach of public safety and the brand's social licence. Events like this don't just interrupt recovery, they can restart the distrust recovery cycle entirely. We've also developed an early warning system for clients called the Risk Magnitude Scale. Clients receive alerts when distrust reaches predetermined danger levels. Now, a word of warning, the previous benchmark recovery rate slides were built on net trust or net distrust, but the risk magnitude scale algorithm is built only on distrust. The following slide is built solely on monthly distrust. This chart shows Optus on the risk magnitude scale, which converts monthly distrust scores into clear risk thresholds: alert, high alert, and crisis. Optus fell sharply into crisis territory immediately after the September 2022 data breach, one of the steepest declines we've recorded. A second spike occurred in November 2023, following the national outage and the Senate inquiry. And then over the past year, Optus has climbed back towards the alert range, but the recovery's been fragile and inconsistent. With the Triple Zero outage in September, Optus is highly likely to re-enter crisis territory, a level where distrust becomes self-reinforcing and significantly harder to pull back from. So has Optus recovered? If we look back 5 years, say, Optus was gaining market share in both prepaid and postpaid mobile spaces. But as soon as the data breach occurred in September 2022, this trend reversed, and Optus has since lost all that it gained. Over just the past 3 years, since that data breach, Optus's brand damage is now showing up clearly in the market share numbers. Prepaid has fallen from 19% to 11%, and postpaid has slipped from 33% to 27%. The falls were steepest immediately after the data breach. Meanwhile, amaysim has lifted from a low of 6% in June 2022 to 14%. The message is simple: customers aren't abandoning the network, they're abandoning the Optus brand. Once again, if we look back 5 years, Optus was gaining market share in the fixed broadband space, but as soon as the data breach occurred in September 2022, the trend reversed, and Optus has since lost all that it gained. The signs of green shoots in the latest quarter were before that Triple Zero outage. Now, this chart shows the hallmark of a fragile brand. When distrust is high, even small shocks trigger outsized customer losses. Optus, a deeply distrusted brand, are net losers, down 9 percentage points. Meanwhile, trusted brands like amaysim grow because stable brands absorb pressure. Fragile brands crack. Distrust doesn't just weaken a brand, it removes its ability to hold on to its customers. So in conclusion, trust is now every telco's essential currency. First comes context. Australians are now more likely to nominate a distrusted brand than a trusted one. And telecommunications sits near the bottom of the industry rankings. That means telcos don't get the benefit of the doubt. They're operating into a headwind of national distrust, not on neutral ground. Second, the sector is structurally fragile. A single event is no longer just a bad day. A data breach, network outage, unfair sales penalty, or sharp price rise adds to the growing reservoir of suspicion. Reliability and basic dependability have become the fastest growing reasons for trust, while unreliability is now the most dangerous driver of distrust. Third, Optus is just one more case study in what happens when distrust explodes. 3 years after the data breach, it remains the most distrusted telco. It's spent time in the crisis zone and is still losing share while its own MVNOs grow. And each new incident, like the Triple Zero failure, resets the recovery clock. This is what a fragile brand looks like. Once distrust is baked in, every shock bleeds customers and value. Finally, the way forward. In this environment, trust can't be left to advertising or comms. It has to be engineered into the whole system. Fewer failures, faster fixes, fairer pricing, and instant honesty when things go wrong. For telcos, there really has never been a time when trust and critically the active management of distrust has mattered more to growth, resilience, and licence to operate. And that's a wrap. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel for a whole range of these and other Roy Morgan data and insights, or contact askroymorgan@roymorgan.com. Thank you for joining me today. Have a safe and happy festive season, and I look forward to greeting you again in 2026.